Hey, my friends.
Jennifer didn't even wait for the candles to be blown out before she handed me a single suitcase and the keys to a life she decided I no longer deserved. My 65th birthday became the day I realized my own daughter saw her parents as a debt that had finally been settled. She stood in the foyer of the house I built with my own hands, her eyes as cold as the marble floors she now claimed as her own. "You and Margaret have had your time, but now you need to find your own way," she said, her voice devoid of any hesitation or regret. I didn't reach for an explanation or waste breath on an argument. I simply adjusted my coat and took the handle of the bag. We walked out of the front door, and the sound of the deadbolt clicking behind us felt like the final, sharp snap of a broken bond. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. We didn't look for a taxi or call for help. We simply crossed the street to the wooden park bench directly opposite our home. From that vantage point, I watched Jennifer pull the heavy curtains, acting as if the people who gave her everything had never existed. The evening air was settling in, but my mind was as clear as a winter morning, calculating our next move with practiced, military precision. Margaret sat beside me, her silence a powerful testament to the unbreakable strength we had shared for over 40 years. We weren't broken victims waiting for a miracle. We were survivors observing a massive tactical error our daughter would soon come to regret. Suddenly, a heavy black sedan swerved toward the curb just a few yards away, and I saw a man in the back seat collapse against the glass. The driver jumped out of the car, looking completely paralyzed with fear as he stared at the unresponsive man in the back. The driver was hyperventilating over the steering wheel as if the car itself had caught a fever, his hands shaking like a leaf in a gale. I stood up from the bench, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who knows that haste is the father of all mistakes. Margaret didn't say a word. She simply adjusted her coat, her silence providing the steady rhythm I needed to focus. "Son, if staring at him worked, he'd be running a marathon by now," I said, my voice flat and dry as I pulled the rear door open. The man inside, Mr. Harrison, was gray-faced and clutching his chest with a grip that could have crushed granite. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, a small irony considering his life was currently unraveling at the seams. I've managed factories and directed hundreds of men, so a panicked chauffeur and a failing heart were just another set of variables to be solved. Across the street, I could see Jennifer's silhouette behind the curtain, probably waiting for me to collapse so she could call it a poetic ending to my birthday. She always did have a flair for the dramatic, whereas I prefer the cold comfort of facts and results. I reached into the man's jacket, found the nitro spray he'd let slip, and administered it with the steady hand of a veteran who hasn't felt a tremor in 40 years. "It's a good thing I didn't leave my common sense in that suitcase," I muttered to the unconscious man, "or we'd both be having a very short evening." Slowly, the rhythmic thumping in his chest began to stabilize, the color returning to his cheeks like ink spreading on a blotter. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a mechanic fixing a high-end machine that had been poorly maintained. The driver was already back on his phone, his voice dropping to a whisper of pure, unadulterated fear as he spoke to someone important. In the distance, the low, synchronized growl of heavy engines began to echo through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder with every passing second. Mr. Harrison's eyes flickered open, landing on me with the confusion of a man who'd just taken a sudden, unplanned detour through the afterlife. I checked my own pulse out of habit. It was still steady and stubborn, unlike the cheap zipper on our suitcase that had decided to snag at the worst possible moment, leaving a corner of Margaret's favorite sweater poking out like a white flag. "You're not quite at the pearly gates yet, sir, though I hear the reception there is much faster than the local ambulance service," I remarked, brushing a speck of road dust off his expensive wool lapel. He tried to speak, but I held up a single finger, a gesture that usually silences a boardroom and worked just as well on a sidewalk. Behind us, the front door of my house creaked open, and Jennifer stepped out onto the porch, her face twisted into a mask of pure annoyance because we hadn't vanished into thin air yet. She looked at the scene, the luxury car, the gasping man, and her father acting as a makeshift doctor, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the evening air. "Always making a scene, Aren't you, Dad? Is this your new plan to get attention, playing hero for a stranger? She shouted, her voice trembling with a cruel kind of insecurity. I didn't turn around. I've learned that responding to a barking dog only encourages the noise, especially when that dog used to be your own child. Instead, I tightened the strap on our bag, which contained my only spare suit and a lifetime of memories that were currently rattling like a nervous skeleton. I had spent 30 years protecting her from the harsh winds of the world, only to realize I'd accidentally raised a draft that was now blowing right back at me. Mr. Harrison's hand gripped my forearm, his strength returning with a surprising, steel-like intensity that spoke of old money and even older power. Who is that woman? He rasped, his eyes narrowing as he caught the full force of Jennifer's sneer from across the lawn. I looked at my daughter, seeing not a child, but a stranger who had stolen my furniture and forgotten my name. A temporary tenant who doesn't understand the concept of a long-term lease, I replied, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy boot. The low rumble I'd heard earlier suddenly transformed into a roar as the first of the black Mercedes rounded the corner, their headlights piercing the dusk like the eyes of a hunting pack. The lead car came to a dead stop inches from my toes, and a man stepped out who looked like he hadn't smiled since the late 90s. He didn't look at the driver. He looked straight at the man I was still holding upright. The street was suddenly choked with the kind of expensive German engineering that usually signifies a diplomatic crisis or a very high-stakes funeral. 12 black Mercedes lined up like a wall of polished obsidian, their engines humming in a perfect, expensive unison that made the air vibrate against my ribs. A man with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass stepped out of the lead car, moving with a predatory grace that immediately made me want to check if I'd left the stove on. A ridiculous instinct for a man who no longer owned a kitchen. Margaret reached down to steady our suitcase, which chose that exact moment to let out a long, wheezing groan as the plastic handle finally surrendered and snapped off in my hand. Fine timing for a structural failure, I muttered, looking at the useless piece of plastic like it was a disobedient employee I couldn't fire. Jennifer, sensing a chance to twist the knife, marched down the porch steps with her phone already out, her heels clicking against the stone like a metronome for a disaster. Officer, or whoever you are, these two are trespassing and causing a scene for my neighbors, she called out, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that made my teeth ache. I watched the granite-faced security lead pause. He didn't even turn his head toward her, treating her voice like background static from a broken radio. He leaned in toward Mr. Harrison, his expression shifting from cold stone to absolute, terrifying devotion as he waited for a command. I stood there holding a broken handle and a suitcase that looked like it belonged in a flea market, yet I felt more in control than Jennifer ever would in her designer heels. I've managed enough assembly lines to know that when a machine is this well-oiled, the person at the controls doesn't need to shout to be heard. Mr. Harrison ignored his guard's hand and kept his grip on my arm, his eyes locked onto my daughter as she tried to elbow her way into the circle of power. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being evicted by a child who couldn't even read a room, while the most powerful man in the state was using me as his only anchor. Jennifer's smirk began to falter as she realized the men in suits weren't looking at us with pity, but with a level of lethal calculation that was now directed entirely at her. One of the drivers moved to block her path, his shadow swallowing her whole as he stood between her and the man I had just saved. Jennifer realized the wall of suits wasn't there to support her, so she pivoted to her only remaining weapon, public shaming. "Step away from those people," she shrieked at the security team, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger at us. "These two are vagrants now, and I won't have them harassing honest businessmen on my property line." I looked down at our battered suitcase, which had decided to vomit a single, bright yellow sock onto the pristine asphalt. It was the one with the tiny cartoon ducks Margaret had given me for our anniversary, and seeing it lie there in the glow of 12 Mercedes headlights was a pinnacle of domestic absurdity. "The ducks stay with me, Jennifer. I've always found they have more loyalty than certain family members," I said, leaning down to retrieve it with a slow, deliberate grace that defied my lack of a front door. I felt the security lead's eyes on me, not with pity, but with the sharp recognition of a fellow soldier who understood the value of keeping one's cool under fire. Jennifer's face turned a shade of crimson that almost matched the taillights behind her composure fraying like a cheap rope. They're losing their minds. They don't even know where they are. She yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the neighborhood I had paid for. I stood up, tucked the sock into my pocket next to a stray peppermint and a library card I hadn't used in a decade, and met her gaze. I know exactly where I am, dear. I'm standing on public land, watching a very expensive education go to absolute waste, I replied, my tone as dry as a desert bone. Mr. Harrison was standing fully now, his presence expanding to fill the street, his eyes tracking Jennifer like a hunter watching a particularly loud and clumsy bird. The humiliation he was witnessing wasn't mine, it was hers, and she was the only one too blind to see the scales of power shifting. She reached out to grab my shoulder, but the lead guard stepped in with a movement so fast and silent it seemed to erase the space between them. Don't touch the man who just saved my employer's life, the guard whispered, his voice sounding like a stone being ground into dust. Jennifer froze, her hand hovering in midair, as the realization finally began to leak through her arrogance that she had picked the wrong fight on the wrong day. Mr. Harrison turned to his lead guard and pointed directly at my front door, his expression one of cold, executive finality. Jennifer stared at the guard's hand as if it were a venomous snake that had just materialized from her own designer handbag. Her mouth remained open, but for the first time in 24 hours, the toxic stream of insults had finally run dry. I felt a sudden, ridiculous urge to check my old flip phone for the time, only to realize I'd somehow managed to launch a game of Tetris in my pocket. Timing is everything. Robert, I whispered to myself, watching a digital block fall into the wrong slot while the world's most powerful man waited for my next move. Mr. Harrison didn't look at the cars or the growing crowd. He studied the house, his eyes dissecting the brickwork as if looking for a structural flaw in Jennifer's soul. He spotted the for sale sign she'd already tried to hide behind the hydrangeas, and his jaw tightened with a visible, grinding anger. That house, Harrison began, his voice raspy but gaining the terrifying weight of a gathering storm, seems to have a very high turnover rate for its occupants. I leaned back against the park bench, which was currently the most honest piece of furniture I owned, and let a small, dry smile touch my lips. It was the kind of smile a shark might give right before it stops being a curious shadow and starts being a problem. Jennifer tried to retreat toward the porch, but her heels sank deep into the soft mud of the flower bed I'd spent 3 years perfecting. There was a brief, satisfying squelch as she lost her balance, her dignity disappearing into the peat moss along with her sense of superiority. The begonias always did prefer a firm hand, Jennifer, I remarked, not moving an inch to help her. I watched her struggle, not with pity, but with the detached interest of a man watching a poorly written play reach its inevitable, messy climax. Harrison turned to me, his gaze softening just enough to show he wasn't just a titan of industry, but a man who valued the breath I'd just given back to him. Robert, a man who can save a life while holding a broken suitcase is a man I need to have a very long conversation with, he said. He signaled to his lead guard, and 4 of the suited men began to move toward my front door with the synchronized, lethal intent of a demolition crew. Jennifer's scream of "this is private property" was abruptly cut short by the sound of a heavy boot meeting the oak door I had once hand-carved with my own 2 hands. The oak door I had spent 6 months sanding and staining let out a defiant crack as Harrison's men tested its structural integrity. I felt a sharp pang of regret for the wood, but none for the woman screaming on the other side of it. I always said that frame was built to withstand a siege, though I didn't think I'd be the one providing the heavy artillery, I remarked to Harrison, who didn't even blink at the sound of splintering timber. I adjusted my spectacles, the left hinge held together by a tiny, stubborn piece of tape that was currently the only thing more resilient than my patience. Jennifer was stumbling backward into the hydrangeas, her expensive phone slipping from her fingers and vanishing into the mulch like a discarded toy. I didn't move to catch her. A man who has been tossed onto the street learns very quickly that gravity is a fair and impartial judge. Harrison leaned in, his voice a low vibration that commanded the very air around us. A man of your caliber shouldn't be sitting on a park bench unless he's contemplating which country to buy next. Robert, he said, his eyes never leaving the house. I looked at the broken handle of our suitcase still clutched in my hand and couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of a billionaire offering me the world while I couldn't even carry my own socks. The front door finally gave way with a sound like a thunderclap, and the security team flowed into the foyer like a black tide reclaiming the shore. Jennifer's face drained of color until she looked like one of the marble statues she'd bought to replace Margaret's handmade quilts. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, panicked realization that the old man she'd evicted was now the guest of honor at her own destruction. I didn't offer her a smile or a lecture. Silence is the most expensive thing you can give to someone who is begging for a response. Harrison stepped toward the porch, his presence swallowing the light, and he uttered the single sentence that turned her victory into a life sentence of regret. I hope you enjoyed your hour of ownership, because I just bought the mortgage, the debt, and the very air you're currently wasting. My role in this chapter was ending, but as I looked at Margaret, I saw the fire in her eyes that told me the real reckoning was only just beginning. The silence of the street was broken by the sound of a dozen trunk lids opening in perfect, terrifying unison.
I watched my daughter's face turn the exact shade of sour milk she used to refuse as a toddler, a pale, curdled mask of disbelief. Jennifer always thought my silence was a sign of surrender, never realizing that for the woman who raised her, silence is simply the time I spend choosing which truth will hurt the most. I reached into my handbag for a dignified lace handkerchief, but only managed to retrieve a stray piece of peppermint candy and a coupon for a dry cleaner that went out of business in 2019. Typical, I murmured, smoothing my skirt while the street rearranged itself into a black and chrome battlefield of my husband's making. Robert thinks he's the master of the long game, but I'm the one who taught him that you never show your hand until the opponent is too exhausted to bluff. Jennifer stood in the mud, her ruined designer heels sinking into the flower bed like anchors in a swamp of her own making. I stood up from that park bench with a slow, deliberate grace, my movements refined by decades of holding this family together when the foundation was under pressure. You always did have poor taste in landscaping, dear. The mud really brings out the panic in your eyes, I said as I stepped onto the pavement. I didn't need a suitcase to carry my worth. It was etched into the set of my jaw and the cold clarity of every sacrifice she had just tried to erase. Mr. Harrison looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a powerful man acknowledge the architect behind the hero who had saved him. He offered a slight, respectful nod, a gesture of recognition that my own daughter had never bothered to learn. The black cars weren't just a convoy anymore. They were a steel perimeter, isolating Jennifer in the middle of the mess she'd orchestrated. Robert's pocket let out a tiny, digital beep from his Tetris game, a final, absurd note in the symphony of our daughter's defeat. "Robert, put the blocks away," I whispered. "The real dismantling is about to begin." One of the guards didn't just stand by the car. He pulled out a thick, legal-looking folder that bore the unmistakable seal of the city's high court. The guard presented the folder to Mr. Harrison with a level of solemnity that usually accompanies a death warrant, which, for Jennifer's reputation, it essentially was. I watched my daughter try to buff a scuff out of her shoe with a handful of grass, a mindless, frantic gesture that proved she was finally beginning to drown in her own arrogance. "You always were better at spending a legacy than understanding how one is built, Jennifer," I said, my tone as sharp as the tailoring on Mr. Harrison's suit. I momentarily mourned the loss of my favorite sourdough starter sitting in the fridge. It was 40 years old and far more cultured than the woman currently occupying my kitchen. Robert's pocket let out a final, triumphant chime, signaling he'd finally cleared the board while the world around us continued to splinter. "Excellent work, dear," I noted, though I believe Mr. Harrison is about to achieve a much higher score. The billionaire's eyes scanned the documents, landing on the specific trust agreement I had drafted back when Jennifer still believed in fairy tales instead of power plays. She had forgotten that the house wasn't an asset to be seized, but a sanctuary held under a good conduct clause that could be triggered by the very eviction she had just performed. I had spent decades playing the quiet observer, moving our family security into corners where her greed would never think to look. Mr. Harrison pulled out a ledger that detailed the systematic draining of our retirement accounts, Transactions he had the power to freeze with a single phone call. Jennifer tried to lunge for the paper, but her ruined heels finally betrayed her, sending her stumbling into a pile of discarded moving boxes. She looked up at us, her eyes wide with a sudden, frantic realization that the helpless parents she'd discarded were actually the ones holding the leash. Mr. Harrison closed the folder with a sound like a gunshot and looked directly at the lead guard, his face a mask of absolute, executive judgment. Call the bank and the authorities. I believe we've found a case of elder exploitation that needs an immediate, very public resolution. Jennifer's phone began to vibrate in the mud, a relentless buzzing that signaled the first of many walls closing in on her. She reached for it with shaking hands, but the screen showed a notification from the bank that made her face go completely white. Jennifer stared at her phone as if it were a grenade she had forgotten to throw, her eyes widening as the digital reality of her bankruptcy flickered across the screen. The device reflected a cold blue light, signaling an immediate freeze on every asset she thought she'd stolen while she was busy measuring our bedroom for her new walk-in closet. I looked at Robert, who was currently preoccupied with trying to reattach the broken suitcase handle using a piece of dental floss and sheer willpower, a display of misplaced engineering that was both absurd and heartbreakingly familiar. Robert, let the luggage rest. It's worked harder today than our daughter has in a decade, I said, my voice steady despite the storm swirling around us. Jennifer finally found her voice, but it was thin and reedy, a pathetic ghost of the venom she'd spat when she handed us that one suitcase. You can't just freeze my life. I have the deed, I have the rights. She stammered, looking at the wall of black Mercedes as if they were a cage closing in. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his presence so heavy it seemed to dampen the sound of the evening crickets, his silence more absolute than any legal decree. I remember teaching Jennifer to walk in this very driveway, never imagining that the hands I held would one day be used to push us into the street. The irony of motherhood is that you spend half your life building a person, only to realize you forgot to install a conscience. Robert finally abandoned his repairs, tucking the duck sock deeper into his pocket and standing with a straight back that made him look 10 years younger and twice as dangerous. The deed is a piece of paper, Jennifer, but the trust it was built on was a debt you just defaulted on, he said, his words falling like lead weights in the quiet evening. Mr. Harrison gestured to a man with a tablet, who began reading out a list of corporate violations that sounded like the opening chapter of a very long prison sentence. Jennifer's knees finally betrayed her, and she collapsed into the wet mulch, her expensive designer coat soaking up the very mud she thought she was too good for. I watched her, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, clinical clarity of a woman who knows that some fires are meant to burn until there's nothing left to save. A man in a dark blue uniform, separate from the security detail, stepped out of the lead car and began walking toward the house with a set of heavy, industrial-grade bolt cutters. Jennifer's eyes followed the metal tools with a look of pure, unadulterated terror as she realized her sanctuary was no longer a fortress. The sound of those bolt cutters snapping through the heavy gate Jennifer had locked yesterday was the most satisfying percussion I had heard in decades. Robert, meanwhile, had decided this was the perfect moment to check the mailbox for his missing crossword magazine, seemingly oblivious to the 12 black Mercedes idling behind him. Robert, I don't think the mailman is worried about your puzzles while the city's most powerful man is dismantling our daughter's ego, I said, watching him shake the metal box with a disappointed sigh. He simply adjusted his glasses, which were still held together by that stubborn bit of tape, and muttered that a man without a puzzle is a man without a plan. Jennifer was vibrating with a mixture of rage and terror, her fingers digging into the wet earth as if she could somehow tether herself to the property she had stolen. You can't do this. I have rights. This is my house. She shrieked, but her voice was beginning to sound more like a plea than a command. I looked at her, and instead of a daughter, I saw a stranger who had mistaken my kindness for an expiration date. You didn't just take a house, Jennifer. You tried to take our dignity, and that is a currency you can never afford to repay, I told her, my voice as steady as a mountain. Mr. Harrison stepped into the light of the porch, his shadow stretching across the lawn like a dark, inevitable tide. He didn't look at her with anger, but with the detached coldness an auditor uses when finding a massive, unforgivable error. He handed a set of heavy, brass keys to Robert, who accepted them with a nod that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with justice. Robert didn't say a word, but the way he gripped those keys told me that the lock on our lives had finally been reset. The security team began to move, their presence a silent, overwhelming force that pushed Jennifer further toward the curb. I felt a sharp, bittersweet pang, the kind you feel when you realize you've spent 30 years watering a weed. The lead officer stepped out of his car, his expression unreadable, and began unfolding a document that bore the official crest of the district attorney's office. The officer from the district attorney's office didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who spent his life filing away the broken pieces of family loyalty. Jennifer tried to stand, but the mud had claimed her dignity, leaving her to scramble like a confused kitten in a designer coat. I watched her struggle, reflecting on how I had once spent hours teaching her the importance of a firm foundation, a lesson she clearly only applied to her makeup. Robert was currently busy critiquing the security guard's choice of bolt cutters, informing him that a bit of WD-40 would have saved the blade from that unseemly screech. "Robert, let the man do his job. He's not here for a workshop on tool maintenance," I said, though his stubborn focus was the only thing keeping the air from freezing solid. He just adjusted his taped glasses and muttered that if you're going to break a heart, you should at least use the right equipment for the door. The official began reading the charges: forgery, embezzlement, and a list of financial omissions that sounded like the index of a crime novel. Jennifer's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray as she realized her perfect plan had been a transparent glass box from the very beginning. I had known about the missing funds since last spring, but I've always preferred to give a thief enough rope to ensure they can't blame the knot. "You underestimated us because we moved slower, Jennifer, but you forgot that we were simply taking a better aim," I remarked, smoothing my hair as the wind picked up. Mr. Harrison watched the proceedings with a cold, executive satisfaction, his silent presence acting as the anchor for the justice we were finally claiming. Robert pulled a single, slightly crushed peppermint from his pocket, offered it to the DA with a straight face, and then turned his back on his daughter, sobbing. The guards began removing the new, gaudy lamps Jennifer had installed, placing them on the curb with the same care one might give to bags of trash. Seeing our house being purged of her influence felt like a long overdue fever finally breaking. My daughter looked up at me, begging for the motherly softness I'd used to protect her for years, but that woman had left with the suitcase at noon. Now, there was only the architect of her downfall, watching the blueprint of her life being shredded by the very laws she thought she could outsmart. A second car pulled up, and two men in suits I recognized from our old bank stepped out, carrying the one box Jennifer had sworn was empty. The bank officials placed the heavy metal box on the hood of the lead Mercedes, its surface reflecting the streetlights like a dark mirror of our daughter's grade. Jennifer's scream died in her throat, replaced by a wet, choking sound as she stared at the one secret she thought she'd buried deeper than her own conscience. Robert leaned over, squinting at the box while trying to suppress a sudden sneeze that sounded remarkably like a small engine backfiring in the quiet evening. "I told you that empty box felt suspiciously like 30 pounds of stolen pension records, Margaret," he said, rubbing his nose with a look of mild, academic triumph. I watched my daughter realize that her parents weren't just old and in the way, but were the very people who had documented every cent she'd siphoned into her offshore accounts. We weren't victims of her sudden cruelty. We were the witnesses who had simply waited for the right man to walk into our lives to provide the leverage we needed. Robert reached for his pocket, accidentally pulling a loose thread from his coat that unraveled halfway down his sleeve before he could stop it. "Even my clothes are trying to distance themselves from this situation," he muttered, maintaining a dignity that even a fraying hem couldn't touch. Jennifer crawled toward the Mercedes, her fingers leaving muddy streaks on the polished black paint, begging for a mercy she hadn't shown us when we were sitting on that bench. Mr. Harrison didn't move. He stood like a statue of Retribution, his eyes fixed on the evidence that would strip Jennifer of her freedom as surely as she'd stripped us of our home. I felt a cold, sharp clarity, realizing that the most dangerous thing anyone can do is underestimate a woman who has spent 40 years cleaning up everyone else's messes. The tragedy isn't that you lost, Jennifer. It's that you thought we were too tired to fight back, I said, my voice cutting through her sobbing like a winter wind. Robert finally caught the end of the thread, snapping it with a sharp flick of his wrist that seemed to echo the finality of the legal proceedings. The DA took the documents from the box, nodding slowly as the weight of the evidence officially tipped the scales of justice toward our favor. Jennifer's arrogance had finally hit a wall of steel, and for the first time in her life, she had no one left to leave the bill to but herself. Mr. Harrison turned to the officer and made a final, quiet request that changed the nature of the arrest from a routine procedure to a total dismantling. He then looked at me, a silent question in his eyes that asked if I was ready to deliver the final word. Jennifer was led toward the back of a squad car, her frantic apologies sounding like a skipping record that no one had the patience to listen to anymore. I watched the flashing lights dance against the windows of our home, the red and blue rhythm finally purging the greed she had brought inside those walls. Robert was currently struggling with the front gate, convinced that the security team had misaligned the latch by exactly 3/8 of an inch during their entry. It's a matter of principle, Margaret. A gate that doesn't swing true is a gate that invites trouble, he muttered, finally forcing the metal back into place with a satisfied click. He still had that yellow duck sock hanging out of his pocket, a small, bright reminder that even in the middle of a war, we hadn't lost our sense of the absurd. Mr. Harrison walked over, his expression one of profound gratitude, and placed a hand on Robert's shoulder as if he were thanking an old friend. The world needs more men who carry duck socks and the courage to stop a heart from failing, the billionaire said, his voice thick with a respect that money could never buy. I looked at the house, seeing it not as a pile of brick and debt, but as the fortress where Robert and I would finally have a peaceful cup of tea without checking for betrayal. Jennifer shouted my name one last time as the car door closed, a desperate sound that I met with a slow, deliberate turn of my head toward the rising moon. I had loved her for 30 years, but I had learned in a single afternoon that some people are simply guests who overstay their welcome. Robert finally picked up our battered suitcase, the dental floss repair surprisingly holding firm, and stood beside me, his eyes bright with the clarity of a man who had won his final battle. I believe my sourdough starter might still be salvageable if we move quickly, Margaret, he remarked, a dry twinkle in his eye that meant he was already planning for tomorrow. We walked up the path together, the 12 black Mercedes beginning to pull away like a shadow retreating from the dawn. We didn't need to look back at the chaos on the curb. We were too busy reclaiming the quiet, heavy silence of a home that was finally ours again. As we crossed the threshold, I felt the weight of 60 years settle into a steady, unbreakable peace. We were not broken by time, but forged by it, standing tall against the wind that tried and failed to blow us down.